Not a chance. Captain Reed Mallory said it without turning from the instrument panel. The flight attendant had stepped into the cockpit doorway, the boy visible just behind her shoulder, 10 years old, round-faced, wearing a NASA t-shirt that was one size too large and carrying a small spiral notebook that he held against his chest like something valuable. "We don't do cockpit visits," Mallory said. "Get him back to his seat." The flight attendant hesitated. She said it was a pre-departure request, the gate agent had mentioned. I said no. Mallory still didn't turn. "Close the door." The boy heard every word. He was standing close enough to the doorway that the instrument panel was visible past the flight attendant's left arm, the green glow of screens, the sweep of gauges, the complexity he had been studying in books for 4 years. He didn't say anything. He looked at the cockpit for 3 seconds with the expression of a child who has learned to receive disappointment without letting it become his face. Then he followed the flight attendant back down the aisle, sat in seat 14C, and opened his notebook. 47 passengers on Flight 2241 from Denver to Chicago saw none of this. They were boarding, settling, adjusting overhead bins. The woman in 14B, a grandmother named Louise, glanced at the boy's notebook and saw, before he turned to a new page, a diagram he had drawn. Something with numbers along the side, lines indicating airflow, annotations in a handwriting too precise for a child his age. Nobody knew who the boy was. Nobody had asked. Nobody had thought a 10-year-old in a NASA t-shirt was worth asking. In 10 seconds after wheels left the tarmac, Captain Reed Mallory would understand that the child he had turned away from his cockpit door was the only person on the aircraft who might be able to help him. Have you ever dismissed someone quickly, without a second thought, and had the world immediately correct you in the most specific way it could? This is a story about Flight 2241, an emergency at altitude, and a 10-year-old boy who had been studying for exactly this moment for 4 years. Stay with this. Let me take you back to the morning before the flight. Marcus Cole was 10 years old and had wanted to be an aerospace engineer since the age of 6, when his uncle had taken him to an air show outside Denver, and he had watched a display of aerobatics that did something to the interior of his chest that he was still working out language for. He had gone home and found every book his school library had on flight. When the school library was exhausted, he had found the public library. When the public library was exhausted, he had found the internet, and the internet had led him to university-level resources that a 10-year-old had no business understanding, and he had understood them anyway. His mother, a woman named Angela, worked as a medical coder and drove 45 minutes each way to work, and raised Marcus and his younger sister on a budget that required a specific kind of attention every single week. She had noticed, when Marcus was 7, that he was not merely interested in flight in the way children are interested in things. He was consuming it the way some people consume oxygen, steadily, necessarily, as if without it something vital would not function. She had bought him a notebook and told him to write down everything he was learning. He had filled 17 notebooks in 3 years. The 18th notebook was the one he had on Flight 2241. Its first 40 pages contained his ongoing project, a self-designed curriculum and aeronautical systems that he had been building since January, pulling from FAA training manuals, from MIT OpenCourseWare aerodynamics lectures, from first principles physics he had learned from YouTube channels run by people with actual aerospace engineering degrees. He had a section on hydraulic systems. He had a section on instrumentation. He had a section, 47 pages in, on emergency procedures, specifically instrument failure scenarios and the decision trees that trained pilots use to navigate them. He had been studying that section for 3 weeks because of a book he had found at a used bookstore, a 1993 training guide for commercial pilots that had been donated, he imagined, by someone who no longer needed it. It was dense and technical and used language that required a dictionary the first time through. He had read it twice. He had made notes in his notebook. He had never been in an actual cockpit. Captain Reed Mallory had made sure that stayed true for one more flight. Captain Mallory was 51 years old and had been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years. He was, by most conventional measures, an excellent pilot. His record was clean. His reputation among the crew was that of a professional who ran a tight, orderly flight deck. He had, over 23 years, developed the specific characteristic of very experienced people in high-stakes environments, a high confidence in his own competence that occasionally crossed into a confidence in his own invulnerability. He had turned the boy away because he was busy, because the pre-departure checklist was running, and because, if he was honest, in the way that people are honest only with themselves in quiet moments they don't examine, he had looked at the child at the door and made a quick calculation that didn't include the possibility that the child was worth thinking about. Flight 2241 departed Denver International on time at 10:47 in the morning. The weather was clear. The first 40 minutes of the flight were unremarkable. At 11:29, at an altitude of 34,000 feet over western Nebraska, the primary flight display, the PFD, the main instrument screen directly in front of the captain, flickered once and went dark. In the 2 seconds it took Mallory to register what had happened, his first officer, a younger pilot named Dennis Huang, called it out. The backup systems were activated. Most of them responded normally. But a secondary hydraulic pressure indicator, tied to the PFD system, showed an anomalous reading that neither Mallory nor Huang had encountered in a live scenario. They had trained for it. It appeared in the manual as a conditional fault code, but the specific combination of display failure plus the secondary pressure reading created an ambiguity that the standard checklist did not resolve cleanly. The aircraft was stable. The passengers had not been alarmed, but Mallory was looking at a combination of readings that required a decision about whether to follow the standard instrument failure protocol or the hydraulic anomaly protocol, and the two protocols in this specific configuration gave different initial steps. The wrong choice in a hydraulic system was not automatically catastrophic, but it was not nothing either. He was on the radio with Denver ATC within 30 seconds. ATC was helpful in the way that ground support is helpful at altitude. They could confirm what the protocol said, but they could not see what he was seeing, and the question was not what the protocol said, but which protocol applied to this specific reading. Dennis Huang said, "I've seen this in the sim, but the sim had a different secondary reading." Mallory said, "I know." They worked through it. 4 minutes in, they had narrowed it to 2 options. Both were defensible. Neither was certain. In seat 14C, Marcus Cole had felt the change, not the physical change, which was minimal, but something in the quality of the flight attendant's movement in the aisle, something in the sound, something that his 4 years of absorbed knowledge was processing without being asked to. He opened his notebook to the emergency procedures section. He read the fault code descriptions. He read them again. He found the entry for primary PFD failure with concurrent hydraulic pressure anomaly. He read the decision logic, and then he read the footnote. The 1993 training guide footnote, which he had copied verbatim because footnotes, he had learned, were where the important qualifications lived. The footnote specified a condition under which the standard hydraulic protocol produced a false positive, a combination of altitude and ambient temperature differential that could cause a secondary pressure indicator to read low without actual pressure loss. Current altitude 34,000 feet. The Colorado to Chicago routing in November. The temperature differential was consistent with the footnote condition. Marcus looked at what he had written. He looked at it again. He took out his pencil and circled the paragraph. Then he sat for 30 seconds, the way children sit when they have to decide whether to be small or whether to be what they are. He got up. He walked to the front of the plane. The flight attendant, her name was Sandra, saw him coming and started to redirect him. Marcus said, "Please listen to me. I think I know what's happening." Sandra looked at him. Something in his face, the notebook in his hand, the absence of fear, the specific quality of a child who is not performing seriousness but actually feeling it, stopped her. She picked up the cabin phone. She called the cockpit. She said, "Captain, there's a passenger who wants to speak to you. I think you should talk to him." Pause. "He's 10 years old." Longer pause. "I know, please talk to him." The cockpit door opened. Dennis Huang looked at Marcus. Marcus held up the notebook. He pointed to the circled paragraph. He said in a voice that was entirely steady, "The secondary reading might be false. It's in the footnote. It depends on the temperature differential at this altitude. If it is, then the hydraulic protocol will make it worse, not better." Mallory turned from the instruments. He looked at the child. He looked at the notebook. He said, "Let me see that." He read the circled paragraph. He read it twice. He looked at Dennis. Dennis picked up the manual on the co-pilot's side and turned to the same section. The footnote was there, identical. Mallory looked at the ambient temperature reading. He looked at the altitude. He did the calculation, brief, silent, the calculation of a man who has 23 years of experience and has just been handed the piece he was missing. He followed the instrument failure protocol instead of the hydraulic one. The secondary reading over the next 4 minutes resolved to normal. The PFD backup system stabilized. The anomaly cleared. At 11:41, 12 minutes after the initial failure, the flight deck was normal. The passengers never knew. The flight landed in Chicago at 12:52 without further incident. After landing, after the gate, after the passengers had deplaned, Mallory walked down the aisle to seat 14C. Marcus was still there, collecting his notebook and his carry-on bag, his NASA t-shirt slightly wrinkled from the flight. Mallory stood in the aisle. He was a large man and the aisle was narrow, and he looked for a moment like someone deciding how to say something for which there was no practiced phrasing. He said, "I owe you an apology for the cockpit." Marcus looked up at him. "I know," he said. "It was not unkind. It was just accurate." Mallory said, "How did you know about the footnote?" Marcus held up the 1993 training guide which he had retrieved from his bag. He said, "I found it at a bookstore. The footnotes are usually the best part." Mallory looked at the book. He had trained with that manual. He could not have told you with certainty whether he had ever read that footnote. Sandra, the flight attendant, was standing at the front of the cabin watching this. She would later say that she had never, in 14 years of flying, seen a captain stand in the aisle and apologize to a passenger. She would say that the thing that stayed with her was not even the apology. It was the moment before it, when Mallory had first turned to look at the boy, and his face had moved through about 12 things in 2 seconds, and the last thing it settled on was something she could only describe as honest. The story didn't stay internal, Sandra told a colleague, the colleague told a friend, the friend was on social media. The version that circulated was accurate in its essentials. Flight emergency at altitude. Pilot initially refused child access to cockpit. Child self-directed study contained the key to the solution. Pilot apologized. The aerospace engineering community, which has its own social networks and its own version of viral, got hold of the story quickly. An aerospace engineer at JPL with a large following in the STEM education space posted about it. The post was specific. It named the training guide. It explained the footnote. It explained why the fault code scenario was genuinely non-obvious. It said, "This kid read a 1993 manual footnote that saved a commercial flight and was originally turned away from the cockpit door." That post was read by the dean of the engineering school at the University of Colorado, Denver, who was, it turned out, the kind of person who believed that when the world showed you where the talent was, you went to find it. The dean's office called Angela Cole's number the following Thursday. What followed was not instantaneous. These things never are. But it was real, and it moved. An early admission pre-engineering track at the university, designed for exceptional students in the 9 to 14 range, identified Marcus as its inaugural member. His notebooks were requested as part of the enrollment portfolio, all 17 of the filled ones, plus the 18th. His advisor, a professor of aeronautical systems who had spent 30 years teaching people how to fly and how to think about flight, read them in a single sitting and called the dean back and said 3 things. "Where did you find this child? Why didn't we have a program for this already? And what are we going to do to make sure he stays?" Captain Reed Mallory filed a voluntary incident report that included his account of the cockpit interaction, both the initial refusal and the post-incident assistance. The report was, by the standards of aviation incident documentation, unusual. It included an explicit acknowledgement of error and a specific commendation for an unlicensed, uncredentialed 10-year-old who had read a footnote that a 23-year veteran had not had ready. The report was reviewed at the Airline Safety Division. A copy was forwarded with appropriate permissions to the FAA's Safety Education Branch. The footnote, it turned out, was not unique to the 1993 manual. It appeared in updated form in the current training materials, but in a section that was not, by standard training practice, given significant emphasis. The Airline Safety Division recommended a training update. The update was implemented in the following year's recertification cycle. Approximately 400 active commercial pilots reread that footnote, because a 10-year-old in a NASA t-shirt had found it at a used bookstore and written it in his 18th notebook. Marcus Cole began the pre-engineering track at the University of Colorado, Denver the following September. He was 10 years and 4 months old. He brought all 18 notebooks. His mother drove him to the first day and watched him walk into a building that was 3 times the size of his school and full of people who were 8 years older than him, and she watched him walk with the particular stride of a child who has always known where he was going. She went home and cried the way you cry when you have worked very hard for a very long time, and the world has finally started cooperating. Marcus did not become an aerospace engineer immediately because he was 10, and things take time, and time is how anything real gets built. But the track he was on, the notebooks he carried, the footnotes he read, the 23 hours he spent studying emergency procedures for a flight he was eventually on, was not a beginning. It was already deep into the middle of something. He still has the 1993 training guide. He keeps it on the shelf above his desk. He has read it 6 times. He is currently working on the 7th. If this story lit something up in you, if you know a child like Marcus, or if you were a child like Marcus, share this. Let it find them. Like it, subscribe, hit the bell, and tell me in the comments, What is the thing you taught yourself that nobody thought to ask you about? Leave it there. I want to read every single one. Here is what really gets me about this story. It is not the emergency. It is not even the footnote, extraordinary as that is. It is the 30 seconds in seat 14C. The 30 seconds Marcus sat after he found the circled paragraph, holding the notebook, deciding. He had just been turned away from a door, told not once but by implication many times over, by the closed cockpit, by the flight attendant's hesitation, by the whole weight of every assumption in that aircraft, that he was not someone to be taken seriously, and he sat for 30 seconds. And then he got up, because the work was the work, and the work was needed, and he was the one who had done it. What was your cockpit door? What did someone close in your face that turned out to be exactly the door you needed to walk through? Leave that for me in the comments. I want to know about the notebook you kept when nobody was asking to see it. I want to know about the footnote you read that nobody else thought mattered, because somewhere in this world there is a flight at 34,000 feet that needs exactly what you know, and the only question is whether you'll get up.